My name's Christine, and today we're going to be going over machine sewing basics. But if you haven't seen my previous video on hand sewing basics, make sure you watch that one first because it's very important. Sewing used to be a crucial aspect of home economics until around the 1960s and 70s when manufacturing moved overseas to create less expensive, more affordable, ready-to-wear garments. And the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s also pushed more women into the workforce, so they didn't have as much time to sew when they came home from work. So at that time, there was a decrease overall in women sewing and an increase of women just purchasing their garments already completely made and ready to wear from retail outlets. But even though sewing is no longer a crucial aspect of everyday home economics, it's still really fun to do, and you're going to open yourself up to a lot of possibilities if you learn the skill of sewing. Today I'm going to cover the sewing machine basics of a standard sewing machine and a serger. This here is a Singer Stylus 834. This is going to be different than a lot of the machines you'll see on the market today because it's made with metal parts and it's also built into this desk. This desk is a part of the sewing machine itself. So even though this machine is around 50 years old, it still runs really well today. Over here I have a Singer Pro Finish serger. This is going to be kind of your basic serger, and I would highly recommend getting a better quality one if you want to sew professionally. This is more of a basic serger for beginners or people who sew as a hobby. When you're buying a sewing machine, if you're new to sewing, just get a regular sewing machine. Don't bother with the serger yet until you're a little more experienced. A good standard sewing machine is going to be probably around $200 to $300. If you are finding a sewing machine for like $100 or less, it's probably not a good one and you want to save your money for a better one. If you have a higher budget and you want to go up to like $500, you're going to get a really nice sewing machine that may also have embroidery functions as well as probably like an automatic buttonhole or two. You can get really fancy with them. If you're looking for a serger, this one was $200. It's, like I said, that's a basic serger. If you want one that's more industrial or better quality, you're going to be looking in the range of more like $500 to $800. They can go up to $1,000 as well. And I recommend holding on to your sewing manuals as well. These have a lot of information in them. They're going to teach you how to use your specific machine properly, and I frequently refer to mine for information about my own sewing machines as well. So if you're new to sewing and you want to learn about sewing machine basics, let's get started. As with all machines, you will have a certain amount of maintenance with the sewing machine. So you want to make sure you have a brush to dust off any extra lint. And you also want to have some oil to lubricate the parts. You want to refer to your sewing machine specifically for information on what you need to oil. With the brush, you're just going to clean out your bobbin section here. Make sure you don't have any extra lint. So before we get started, let's go over the parts of a sewing machine. Most machines are going to have an on switch over to the right side. When you turn it on, a light will illuminate. When the light on your machine is on, your machine is also functional. This is the pedal that you will use to operate your machine. If you are working on your machine, make sure your foot is not on this pedal. You can also unplug the pedal from your machine. It's either going to be located on the side or underneath. If you twist this knob here, your needle will come out. That is essential if you need to change your needle or your needle breaks while you're sewing. Down here you have your presser foot. So this will press your fabric as you're sewing and hold it in place. This is also removable. Sometimes you'll have a latch that holds it on. Sometimes you'll just flip it up and bring it down. This knob here will tighten the tension on your presser foot. This here is your plate. It will close and open. Inside here we have a bobbin holder. Bobbins come in different materials. I usually prefer the metal ones. I think they're a lot more durable, but you can use plastic bobbins as well. Over time these will deteriorate and they will not work as well. You'll have the thread will wind around the center of the bobbin, and then you will insert the bobbin into your machine like this. There is a little hook inside your bobbin holder that you have to thread your bobbin through, and then you'll just make sure you have plenty of slack on your thread When you sew, you will close this plate all the way. Underneath your foot, you'll have little ridged pieces. That is called your feed dogs, and that actually feeds your fabric underneath the foot while you are sewing. Up here we have our tension discs. We feed our thread through this. This will determine how tightly your machine stitches. This dial here controls your tension disc. You're normally going to want to keep it on about 5. That's an average tension. This dial here will determine what type of stitch you're using. This machine offers a blind hem stitch, a zigzag stitch. If you're sewing a regular straight stitch, you'll keep it in the middle on that zigzag one. This knob here determines how wide you want your stitch to be. So if you're making a straight stitch, you'll bring it all the way over to the left and you'll have no width to your stitch. If you want a really wide zigzag, you'll bring it all the way over to the right, where you'll have a nice wide stitch over here. This dial over here determines your needle position. So if we turn this over to the left, your needle rotates to the left. If we move it to the right, your needle rotates to the right. Most of the time you're going to be using that center. This dial here determines how long your stitches will be. You'll see it offers a very fine option, and down on by the lower numbers, this will be a really wide stitch length. This machine also, if you continue to turn it, offers a 4-step buttonhole option. Most machines are going to offer a 4-step buttonhole option, but you can also find some that offer 2-step or an automatic. If you press this button in the middle, your machine will sew backwards. This is very important when you are starting or finishing a seam. To the right of your machine, you will have a hand dial. If you move it clockwise, your machine will sew forward. If you move it counterclockwise, your machine will sew backward. Here is where your thread will sit, and then we'll feed it through. So before you can sew, you have to first thread your bobbin. You take a spool of thread, and you're going to attach it tightly to your machine here. So everyone's machine will be a little bit differently. Make sure you consult your machine before you thread a bobbin. Your bobbin will have little holes in it. You want to take thread and feed it from the inside of the bobbin to the out. Insert the bobbin wherever your machine keeps it. For this machine, if I push the bobbin to the right, it will activate. I also have a button on the dial I have to press. For mine, I wrap it around this metal piece here. So you want to make sure there's a little bit of tension from your thread all the way to your bobbin. You also want to make sure that this tail on your thread outside your bobbin is not too long. If it is too long, it will get wound up in your bobbin, and when you're later sewing, it'll get in the way. Hold on to it when you do press your pedal down, and then your bobbin will automatically stop winding when it is full. Make sure your machine is shifted back to the correct position. If you had a button you had to press over here, make sure it's not pressed anymore. Clip off that little extra thread you had there. Always consult your owner's manual before threading your machine. My machine specifically says to lift up the presser foot, and that will release the tension discs while I'm threading it. For my machine, again, we'll hold the thread up in this notch up here. We'll bring it down here. We'll hook it in this notch here. And then the tension discs, you'll have a hook on the bottom. It feeds up through the tension discs. And then there's another hook that I have to wrap it around down here. Make sure your lever is in the upright position over here. We're going to feed it down and up. I'm going to make sure there's a little bit of tension on that when you're pulling it. And then there's another hook here to stabilize it, as well as one right above the needle. When you're threading the actual needle, make sure you're coming from the front side and threading it through the back. Then hook your thread underneath your foot. Always place your bobbin in clockwise. And then most machines have a little hook that you have to hook the bobbin into. You will then take your hand dial. Make sure you're holding the thread from the needle. You'll rotate it. And that will bring up the thread from your bobbin. I usually take a pair of scissors and pull it gently that way. When you're first learning how to sew, use some sort of cotton or polyester fabric to start with. It'll be easier. This is just an old bed sheet that I've cut up. If you are using pins, make sure that your machine does not sew over your pins. That will break your needle. Start with both your bobbin thread and your needle thread pulled back behind your machine. Keep in mind that these little lines and notches on your plate here are for your seam allowance. They help you guide you while you're sewing. Line your fabric up with your foot. There should be a lever either on the back side or on the side of your machine. You're going to bring your presser foot down. I'm going to press my back stitch button here and just stitch a few back stitches in my fabric. Then I'm going to release it and sew forward the full width of my seam. And when you get to the end, you're going to back stitch again. You'll then pull your presser foot up. Make sure your needle is in an upright position, and then pull your fabric away from your machine. Your stitches will look something like this. I have 2 lines of stitches here because I practiced one before showing you. So this is the front side and then this is the back side. Your front and back should look the same unless you're using different colors of thread. This is just a regular straight stitch. It's going to be a lot quicker to make a straight stitch with a sewing machine than it will to hand sew. It's also going to be a lot neater. But if you mess up, you'll have to take it all out and redo it. So in the event that your stitch comes out wrong, you'll need a stitch ripper. You'll have to take your seam out, repin it, and start again. So now that you know how to make a straight stitch with the sewing machine, let's make a zigzag stitch. So make sure that your machine is set on a zigzag here. You're going to widen your stitch width to however wide you want your stitch to be. Set your needle position to either the left or the right. And again, set your stitch length as well. Line your fabric up much how you would with a regular straight stitch. I have found that back stitching with a zigzag stitch doesn't always work as well, so sometimes I keep it in a straight stitch formation while I sew my back stitch and then switch it over to a zigzag stitch when I'm sewing the seam. But we're going to start with just a regular zigzag back stitch here. And we're going to sew forward through our fabric. And zigzag a back stitch here. If you want a more obvious zigzag, you can adjust your stitch length to a finer stitch. And you'll see the second zigzag stitch here. It's a lot finer, but the zigzag itself is more visible. Let's set our stitch length back to normal. Now we're going to try a blind hem stitch. So I'll move this all the way over to the left to get to our blind hem stitch. This is normally used for hemming up pants or skirts. Again, we're going to start with a back stitch here. So you'll see this one has a much different shape to it. So this is called a blind hem stitch because it's not a straight line across. It has a few breaks in it, which make your thread not show up as much. So this is the front side, and you'll have the back side over here. When you sew around a corner on a sewing machine, it's going to be very similar to sewing around a corner while hand sewing. So you're going to set it up how you normally would with a regular straight stitch. You're going to start out with a back stitch. Then you're going to stitch forward. Make sure with your hand dial that you have your needle in your fabric. You're going to lift up your presser foot and rotate the fabric at an angle. You're going to sew 2 or 3 stitches across. It's okay to use the hand dial or your pedal, whatever you prefer. Make sure your needle's in your fabric again. You're going to lift up your presser foot. Rotate your fabric. And then sew to the end. And again, we're going to back stitch. Remember, that's how we get that nice point on the fabric when you turn it inside out. Most machines I've ever worked with had a 4-step buttonhole. So you'll want to start by moving it to the first step. It is good to outline on your fabric how long you want your buttonhole to be as well. To start how we normally would, you're not going to back stitch. You're just going to use slot number 1. When you've sewn the length of your buttonhole, you'll switch it to number 2. And just sew a few stitches side to side. Then you'll adjust it to number 3. It's going to sew backwards on your fabric. Adjust it to number 4. It's going to go side to side and finish up the end of your buttonhole. So you should see this buttonhole here. As you can see, the first step, the second step, as well as the third step look all right. It's that fourth one that doesn't look right. You want to make sure that it's going to go all the way around your buttonhole. If your machine isn't working or you're having trouble getting that fourth one all the way, you can take the threads, thread them through a needle, and then hand sew that bar tack over the end. That's what I've been doing with this machine, because as you can see, sometimes the tension doesn't work well, or in order to get that bar tack over the last piece, it kind of bunches up the thread. So usually what I've been doing lately is I sew the first 3 sections, and then I take the thread and manually sew that bar tack on at the end. And always make sure you turn your sewing machine off when you're done. This is a serger. It's gonna look a lot different than a regular sewing machine. You actually have 4 spots for thread to go on the back. And it also has this bar up here that holds the thread that you feed the thread through for tension. You want to make sure this is in the upright position when you start sewing. On my serger, the power switch is on the outside. Again, your light will turn on. Make sure with a serger that you do not have your foot on that foot pedal, because this can really damage your fingers and your hands. This can really cause a lot of damage if you accidentally start sewing with it when you're maintaining it. The dial on this machine will only go one way. You only sew forwards with a serger. There are some sergers that have an option for a back stitch, but most do not come with one. This dial here will set your stitch length And this dial down here will set your tension. If you move this lever all the way up, it'll make a ruffle stitch. If you move it all the way down, it'll make a stretch stitch or a stretched out stitch, depending on what type of material you're using. So very similar to your regular sewing machine, you'll have your tension discs up here. And the higher your number, the tighter your tension is. Now, like I said, this machine here is not a very great serger. It doesn't have very good tension, and I have to mess with these dials a lot while I'm sewing. So anytime I sew, I'm going to take my fabric and I'm going to sew a seam with it just to see how that seam comes out, and then I will be constantly adjusting these tension dials as I'm sewing to make sure that my actual garment will look nice and that the seam will be strong when I'm sewing the actual garment. So this section here comes off. The inside workings of your serger are going to be a lot different than your regular sewing machine. You'll have a piston here that you will have to grease regularly, whereas on a regular sewing machine there's usually only one spot that you need to use oil, and you won't have to do it very often. This also, up in here, you want to grease this piston up in this side as well. As you sew with the serger, you're going to get a lot of lint in here. So you want to take your brush and you want to make sure that you get all the lint out before you start sewing. Before you get too carried away with your serger, there's always one very important part that you have to be careful. This part right here is a knife. It is sharp along this edge. That's how it cuts your fabric off while it sews. It makes a nice cut seam. But that knife can really be damaging if you get yourself caught in it. So when you do thread your machine, it is best to flip your knife up and out. This serger, like a lot of others, is color-coded and it has numbers so you know what threads to use first when you are threading. First, we're going to take our thread here, make sure it is securely in the tension discs on top. So there's a hook behind the tension disc. We'll bring it right down through the tension disc and through the hook on the underside. We will then follow the directions exactly as to how the serger says it is going to be threaded. So we bring it down to the color-coded orange dot here. Going to hook it here as well. It goes above this hook. And the tricky part is we have to thread it through this little eye here. And same as with our regular sewing machine, we want to make sure it is pulled through the back over here, underneath the presser foot. So the next thread is going to be the most difficult one. So we make sure we pull it through the tension hooks on the back, slide it down through our tension discs and through the hook on the bottom side. And then we'll follow the color-coded hooks down here as well. The tricky part of this one is we have to wrap it around here. It has to slide into a hook, and then we also have to thread the eye of the needle it's attached to. Okay. Make sure we move it behind the other thread here that's already sewn. We don't want to wrap it over the top. So then we're going to thread our needles. Now this machine is capable of sewing with just one needle, but I usually prefer to use 2 needles because I think it makes the seam stronger. So according to this, we're going to thread the A needle first, which is the second thread here. Thread it through all the hooks up here at the top. Bring it down through the tension discs. And then we'll see this one comes up above the green dot here. Into its little hook and thread the A needle here. And we'll pull this one to the back side as well. And last but not least, we're going to thread our 4th thread, the blue one. The blue one comes underneath the second hook here, over the blue dot. We're going to thread it through the B hook and thread the B needle as well. And again, pull this to the back as well with the other threads. So now you have a threaded serger. So when you want to sew, make sure you bring your knife back down. You can sew without the knife. I just feel like it doesn't make the edges nice, so I always sew with my knife to cut the edge of the seam off. So there's also a little option here. You can rotate the style here and it will make the width of your stitch either wider or narrower. I usually keep mine on the same setting just so I don't have to constantly mess with it. This presser foot will press down a lot more than a regular sewing machine will. When you feed your fabric in, you'll have to lift it up just a hair and set your fabric underneath it. Just as you would with a regular sewing machine, make sure your foot is in the down position when you begin to sew. Right where this knife is where it's going to sew the actual seam, so we want to line that up really well. This is a serged seam here. As you can tell, the tension isn't great. It's really lumpy at the top. And from the back side, the little zigzag looks a little odd as well. So we can tell here the bottom seam is too loose. So that's going to be this yellow thread here. This is too loose. So I want to tighten that before I sew the next seam. After adjusting the tension discs a little, we can tell this seam definitely looks a lot better. It is still pulling to one side, so I'm going to loosen the tension on my top side here. This is where you make sure that you have your thread all the way through the tension disc. This one likes to come off to the side a little bit, so I want to make sure it's snugly in that tension disc. So now we'll see that that's a much tighter stitch here. That looks a lot better. But it might even be a little bit too tight on the back now. So now we know the problem was that we didn't have it threaded through the tension disc. We had it to the side. So I'm going to loosen that back up. So this side is coming in just a little bit pulled to the back. So we might want to loosen the front tension disc a bit too. So that looks a lot better. Your lines on each side are going to be vertical. They're not going to be shifted off to one side too much. On the back side you have nice triangles and you'll see them loop together on the top. So the key to getting proper tension on a serger is you want both your front and back threads to loop along the top. If you pull on the seam, you won't feel the threads pulling apart. If they're not adjusted properly, you will feel one of the threads pull because one of the threads is looser or tighter than the others. I don't have much of a problem with the two main needle threads. Those are usually pretty standard. I don't have to adjust those a whole lot even when I'm changing to a heavyweight fabric. But you will see if those are not adjusted properly, you'll have bigger loops along the bottom, or you'll see big loops on the back side as well where the tension is not set correct. As you can see, when you're using a serger, it's going to chop off a lot of fabric. The more you try to adjust it, the larger your pile will become. So it's really important when you are using a serger, always check your tension with your fabric before you sew anything, because you will ruin a project if you just immediately sew a seam onto a garment and your tension's not set properly. If I do baby a machine like this and I set the tension discs properly, I can get a very nice seam from it. And this is a finished seam. I don't have to cut it when I'm done. I don't have to go back over it with a zigzag stitch, and it's not going to unravel or unfold. So when you're using a serger to sew a corner, it's not going to be the same as you would a regular sewing machine. If you try to just cut the corner this way, the fabric's going to get gummed up in your knife. It's not going to make a nice corner, and it can also break your needles. So you want to be careful not to do that. If you want to use a serger to sew a corner, you want to first take a pair of scissors and cut that corner at the width of your seam allowance. Okay. So we're going to start here. Alright, we're going to come to the very edge of that fabric. We're going to lift our presser foot up, rotate. Make sure our presser foot is back down. And you can see that finishes a much nicer corner if you make sure you do it properly. You can tie off your thread a few different ways. You can make a knot in it and just clip it. You can make a knot and then feed it back through the seam that you've sewn. That's normally what I do. Or you can also use a little bit of free check, and that'll just strengthen the end of it and you won't have a tail hanging off that way. You can try all the different ways to finish a serger thread and then pick which one you like the best. Sometimes you'll pick a different one depending on the project as well. And always turn your machine off when you're done as well. Thank you everyone for watching this video all the way through. If you like it, go ahead and hit that like button at the bottom. If you want to learn how to make a specific project, leave a comment below and I will make a video for you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can watch more of my videos as they come out. Thank you everybody for watching. I'll see you next time.